Karen didn't just block my bridge, she blocked my life. No food deliveries, no internet, no job interviews, just me, a barricade, and a clipboard dictatorship. And the worst part, she thought she owned it. The bridge, my bridge, the one my grandfather built with his bare hands. So yeah, I let her build her wall just so I could knock it down with 60 years of receipts. I used to think rock bottom was eating expired ramen in a motel parking lot while Googling how to sell plasma for rent. Turns out rock bottom is when a middle-aged woman in a purple blazer takes a no-access HOA zone sign across the only bridge to your house and then cites you for illegal flag proportions before you've even finished your first cup of coffee. That was my welcome back to Clearwater Pines, Montana, a community so pristine, even the squirrels look like they pay HOA dues. I hadn't lived here since I was 12, but after getting blacklisted from the tech industry and watching my marriage dissolve like a cheap tablet in water, moving into my grandfather's old cabin felt like my only option. It was remote, peaceful, and according to Google Maps, not even within HOA jurisdiction. But Clearwater Pines had changed while I was away, and apparently so had the rules. I pulled up to the bridge just before sunrise, coffee steaming in one hand, and that's when I saw it. A fresh wooden barricade strung with bright orange tape and a sign that screamed bureaucracy in Comic Sans, community, property, access limited. At first, I thought maybe the county was doing maintenance until she stepped out of a white Subaru like she was walking onto a stage. Purple blazer, clipboard thick enough to stop a bullet, blonde bob helmeted in place like a military-grade wig. "Excuse me," she said, before I even put the car in park. "You can't be here. This is a controlled entryway. HOA regulations prohibit unauthorized crossing." I tried to explain I wasn't a tourist or trespasser. I was Ethan Walker, and this was my grandfather's property, my property now. She squinted at me like I'd just claimed to own a piece of the moon. "I'm Karen Withers, president of the Clearwater Pines Homeowners Association," she said, like it was supposed to mean something. "And this bridge is part of our community infrastructure. If your paperwork isn't registered with the HOA office, I'm afraid you're in violation." I opened my glove compartment and pulled out the deed, still folded from the county office. She glanced at it, tapped her pen against the clipboard, and muttered something about improper filing procedures. "Also," she added, as if reading from a script, "your vehicle is parked at a non-conforming angle, and that flag," she pointed to a small American flag attached to my porch post across the bridge, "violates our 2:1 ratio requirement relative to HOA standard banners." It was 7:08 a.m., and I had already broken 3 regulations I didn't know existed. All I'd done was show up. I asked, politely, because I was still clinging to the fantasy that we were civilized people, where I could get a copy of these community rules. She smiled like a school teacher catching you cheating on a test. "All residents receive a handbook upon registration. Since your property was never formally enrolled, you'll need to complete orientation and agree to terms of participation." She handed me a shrink-wrapped packet, thicker than a college biology textbook. I stared at it like it might bite. She nodded, satisfied, and turned back toward her car, heels clicking on the bridge planks like punctuation marks. I sat there a moment longer, engine idling, coffee cold, wondering if I'd made the worst decision of my life. The only sound was the soft creak of the bridge settling and Karen's voice in my head saying, "Regulation 3.4 prohibits decorative gnomes with facial expressions." That night, I skimmed through the handbook like it was a cursed manuscript. Lawn height, regulated. Paint color, pre-approved palette. Parking, only within 3 degrees of property alignment. I knew HOAs had rules, but this wasn't a neighborhood. It was a boot camp in cul-de-sac form. Still, I wasn't ready to throw in the towel, not yet. The cabin was all I had left, and despite the purple blazered gatekeeper of suburban doom, I was determined to make it work. I figured if I played nice, fixed a few things, and kept my head down, maybe the storm would pass. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't possibly know, was that this wasn't a storm, this was a siege. And Karen Withers wasn't just the weather, she was the climate. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that I filed the handbook away, planted some HOA-approved shrubs, and faded into the background like every other poor soul trying to stay off Karen's clipboard. But no. The next morning, I found a neon pink citation taped to my front door. Offense, mailbox height noncompliance. I measured it myself. It stood precisely 36 inches off the ground, which sounded pretty standard to me, but according to Regulation 5.2C, height had to be measured from the base of the post to the bottom of the mailbox opening. Mine apparently was 2 inches too low. I spent an hour shoveling dirt under the post like I was burying a body just to lift it enough to clear the standard. When I looked up, she was already standing at the end of my driveway, arms crossed, clipboard in hand, as if she'd summoned me with the power of petty regulations. Better, Karen said, not quite smiling. Though I've noticed your vehicle is still parked diagonally relative to your lot line. The HOA guidelines specified vehicles must be oriented parallel to the front property boundary, not to the natural slope. She pulled out what looked like a small protractor on a chain and pointed at my gravel driveway, which I now realize sloped gently along the curve of the land. Exactly how my grandfather had built it. We made an exception for Mr. Walter Walker when the HOA was formed, she said, tucking the device away. But grandfathering does not extend to inherited ownership. The citation is $125.00. It'll be emailed to the address on file, assuming you've set up your resident portal account. If not, you'll need to contact our digital compliance officer. Then she was gone again, her SUV vanishing over the bridge like a vanishing act made of scorn and legalese. The next few days were a blur of nonstop corrections. My porch light, too bright after 7 p.m. My wildflowers, unapproved species. Even a small carved bear statue by the steps, something my grandfather had whittled himself, was deemed non-conforming exterior decor. Each violation came with its own fine, its own rule citation, and of course, its own personal visit from Karen. She'd never yell, never raised her voice. She'd just show up like a dentist for your soul, ready to drill into your sense of peace. "I'm not doing this to be difficult," she said once, almost earnestly. "I taught civics for 20 years, Mr. Walker. I believe in systems. Rules create order. Order creates peace. And yet I'd never felt less at peace in my entire life. It was like being stalked by a bureaucracy with bifocals." Then came the noise complaint. "Power tool use after regulated hours," the citation read, filed anonymously by multiple neighbors. But I hadn't used any tools that night. I'd talked about organizing my shed out loud while standing on my porch with a cup of tea and nobody else around. The only person I'd mentioned it to, Jim, the friendly neighbor who'd offered to help me with shrub trimming just 2 days earlier, the same Jim who always knew when Karen was on her way, the same Jim who suddenly stopped waving when I passed his house. Something was off. The timing, the wording, even the specific reference to the tools I'd mentioned but never touched. It all stank. I began to wonder if Jim was part of something bigger than just HOA compliance. I started to feel watched, not by a person, but by a network, a system designed to keep me boxed in and boxed out at the same time. That night, I left the porch light off and sat in the dark by the window waiting. At 10:47 p.m., a familiar set of headlights crept past the cabin, slower than any normal pass-through. I watched as the car paused for just a moment before disappearing over the hill. That's when it hit me. I wasn't just dealing with one overzealous neighbor with a clipboard and a God complex. I was dealing with a surveillance operation dressed up as a community, and that bridge wasn't just a structure, it was leverage, which meant the real battle hadn't even started yet. By the next morning, I'd stopped pretending any of this was about code enforcement. This wasn't about mailbox inches or flower species or diagonal driveways. This was about control. And control, I was beginning to realize, didn't always wear a badge. It wore yoga pants, owned a laminator, and drove a white Subaru with a magnet that read "Proud to Serve." The noise complaint hadn't even fully processed in the online portal before Karen showed up again, clipboard ready, her lips pursed like she was preparing to taste test lemon wedges. "Mr. Walker," she said with professional pity, "we've received additional concerns about nighttime disturbances. Please remember, Clearwater Pines encourages quiet harmony after 7:00 p.m. to promote neighborly coexistence." I didn't reply, I just nodded, because the only thing more dangerous than being angry at Karen was letting her see it. For the next week, I went full Stepford. I painted my mailbox with HOA-approved beige, replaced my grandfather's wildflowers with sterile landscaping shrubs I had to special order from a vendor listed in the back of the community handbook, and even replaced the American flag on my porch with a smaller version because apparently patriotism also had a maximum ratio when measured against. Every time Karen dropped by, I was already mid-compliance. Good progress, she'd say, like a school principal talking to a slow but improving student. You're starting to get it, and then always another citation would follow. One day it was the hose coiled the wrong way on its mouth. Another day, a non-regulation welcome mat with the phrase, "Go away, I'm reading." Jim even stopped by again, pretending like nothing was weird, offering his hedge trimmer if I needed help catching up. I took it and I smiled, but in the back of my mind, gears were turning. Then came the envelope. A formal complaint dated 3 days earlier, citing excessive noise from lawn maintenance equipment at 8:14 p.m. The problem? I wasn't even home that night. I had receipts from a grocery run in town, timestamp. When I called the HOA office to challenge it, I was told the complaint had been confirmed by a board member and 2 residents, but that identities were confidential for community harmony. That's when I knew I was being set up, not just watched, recorded, tracked, logged into some unholy HOA hive mind. I thought about the conversation I'd had with Jim on Tuesday, how I'd casually mentioned that I might trim the hedges after dinner if the weather held. That was the exact activity listed in the complaint. I hadn't done it, but I'd said it, and someone had turned my words into ammunition. That someone had to be Jim, and he wasn't just reporting to Karen, he was her extension, a quiet, smiling, rake-carrying surveillance node. I started watching back, sitting on the porch without turning the light on, leaving a small notepad by the window to log headlights, pedestrian patterns, familiar cars that passed too often. There was a woman who jogged by every day at 6:52 p.m., always with earbuds in, always glancing at my yard like she was checking for weeds. A teenager on a bike who stopped to tie his shoe on the same patch of gravel across from my shed 3 times in 1 week. And this wasn't paranoia, this was a system, and Karen was at the center of it like the sun. Except instead of giving life, she radiated pettiness and plausible deniability. The worst part, it was working. I hadn't slept through the night in days. My heart jumped at every knock on the door. My inbox was a stream of passive-aggressive notices. I wasn't living, I was complying. And that's when it happened. I woke up one morning and found 2 men in hard hats and reflective vests standing at the mouth of the bridge. One held a clipboard. The other was hammering a fresh wooden barrier into place right across the entryway. A bright orange sign read, "Bridge closed, safety review in progress." Karen stood beside them, sunglasses on, arms folded as if she'd just claimed dominion over the continent. "Mr. Walker," she said, voice raised just enough to sound official, "the Community Safety Committee has deemed the bridge structurally questionable. For liability reasons, access is restricted until further notice." I opened my mouth to speak, but all I could hear was the sound of a hammer driving a nail into the last inch of my sanity. Because this wasn't just another HOA stunt, this was a siege. And I was officially under lockdown. I stood there for a long time just staring at the sign, like maybe if I looked hard enough it would undo itself. But no, bridge closed wasn't a warning. It was a verdict. Behind it, 2 guys I didn't recognize were drilling in cross beams like they were sealing a crime scene. Karen didn't even glance at me again. She just turned and walked off like her job was done, leaving me alone with a half-cold cup of coffee and the sound of my world shrinking. I tried reasoning with the crew, asking who hired them, what kind of inspection this was, and whether an actual engineer was coming. One of them shrugged. "We just got told to build a barricade, man. HOA job order. Bridge's got to stay closed until we get the all clear." But no one knew who the inspector was, and no paperwork was produced. It was all just assumed. So at first I thought I could wait it out. Maybe it was a bluff, a stunt. Surely they couldn't just shut down the only access point to someone's private property indefinitely. But they could, and they did. By day 3, the impact hit me hard. The nearest road was 3 miles away by foot through uneven forest trails, barely more than a game path. Delivery stopped, trash pickup stopped. I missed a video call with a potential freelance client because my internet became spotty, thanks to HOA trucks rerouting wiring infrastructure through temporary underground junctions. The next call dropped 3 times in a row before the client emailed, "We've decided to go in another direction." I knew what that meant. A week later, I had to carry groceries in a backpack like I was hiking to a survival cabin, and not the ironic Instagram kind. My knees weren't built for it, neither were my shoes. By day 7, I'd lost 12 pounds, not from exercise, but from the sheer impossibility of feeding myself regularly. Rain hit on day 8. The trail became mud. I slipped, landed on my back, and spent a good 10 minutes staring at the canopy of pine trees, too tired to be angry. The cabin had become a prison, and the woman who built it didn't need walls or guards, just wall laws and orange tape. And yet, every time I checked the bridge, still blocked, still nailed shut, there was no sign of actual repair, no inspector, no assessment, just silence, and the occasional HOA SUV passing the far side of the lake reminded me that while I was stuck in isolation, the world continued, indifferent and well landscaped. I began to wonder if this was the point all along, not to protect anyone, but to punish me for not falling in line fast enough. I called the HOA's listed number. A woman named Denise answered and told me to direct all bridge inquiries to the Community Infrastructure Safety Subcommittee. I asked who was on that subcommittee. She paused, then replied, President Karen Withers and Mr. Jim Lockley. Of course. I was being judged by a woman who fined me for my American flag and a neighbor who reported my long conversations like he worked at the NS. No engineers, no safety experts, just a civics teacher with a citation fetish and her clipboard co-conspirator. I hung up without saying goodbye. That night, I sat at the window, watching the bridge glow faintly in the moonlight beyond the barricade. Somewhere deep down, the part of me that had once loved puzzles, systems, logic, it stirred. This wasn't about rules. It never had been. It was about territory, about leverage, and about making an example of me, which meant if I wanted out, I couldn't go through the bridge. I had to go back before the bridge, before the fines, before Karen, back to the attic. I'd spent so long trying to survive this HOA siege that I'd forgotten one critical fact. My grandfather had built everything himself, the cabin, the deck, the trail, and the bridge. He didn't trust systems. He trusted paperwork. And if there was one thing I hadn't done since moving in, it was dig through his old records. The next morning, I brewed the last of my coffee, climbed the attic ladder, and pulled open the heavy wooden hatch. Dust fell like ash. The air smelled like time, boxes, toolkits, envelopes, maps. And in the far corner, behind a stack of faded National Geographics and an old duck decoy, I saw it, a dented cookie tin, and something told me that's where this ends and where everything else finally begins. The tin was heavier than it looked, dented along the edge, rust blooming around the latch like an old wound. I pried it open with a screwdriver and was immediately hit with the scent of paper older than most of the houses across the lake. Inside, I found a stack of envelopes bundled together with twine, yellowing documents folded with precision, and a few items that clearly hadn't seen daylight in decades. A metal dog tag, a faded black and white photo of my grandfather, standing beside the bridge, proud and shirtless, hammer in hand, and underneath it all, a thin leather folder stamped Cascade County Engineering Debt. I sat back on my heels as if someone had just handed me a loaded weapon, and in a way they had. I opened the folder with hands I didn't realize were shaking. The first document was a letter dated 1963, typed in neat courier font on official county letterhead, granting Walter Walker permission to construct a privately owned pedestrian and light vehicle bridge across what was then classified as a seasonal outlet stream. The bridge was approved as part of a self-funded, tax-assessed infrastructure addition to private property bridge permit. No, 4471. Attached was a detailed sketch, signed and sealed by a county engineer, noting the bridge's dimensions, materials, and location. Behind that were over 50 years' worth of receipts, all under the line item, bridge tax, Walker private easement. The last one, paid in full from me, automatically deducted with my property taxes the month I inherited the cabin. I sat there on the attic floor, surrounded by decades of meticulous record keeping, and realized what I was holding. Not just a paper trail, a lifeline. My grandfather hadn't just built a bridge, he'd carved a legal moat around his land. And while Karen and her clipboard mafia had been throwing around citations like candy at a parade, I had been paying taxes on a structure they had no legal authority to touch, block, or claim. This wasn't a loophole, it was ownership. Documented, continuous, protected. And while I might have spent the last few weeks being treated like a trespasser in my own home, I suddenly had something they didn't. Proof. The next morning, I hiked into town with the folder strapped to my back like a holy relic. The county clerk's office was a squat brick building that smelled like toner and old gum. Behind the counter sat a man named Curtis Myers, who looked like he'd been born there. When I handed him the folder, he flipped through it slowly, humming under his breath. Then he looked up and said, "Well, I'll be damned. Walter always said he wasn't going to let no committee tell him how to cross a stream. Paid every year like clockwork. That's your bridge, son. Has been since 1963. He printed a fresh copy of the tax record and initialed the bottom himself. If they blocked it off, that's a violation on their part, not yours. I thanked him and walked straight to the cafe where Lena Brooks, my one remaining ally in the neighborhood, was sipping coffee and scrolling through legal blogs on her tablet. I laid the folder on the table and told her everything. She didn't blink, just opened the documents and started snapping photos like a crime scene tech. "Ethan," she said, "this isn't just helpful. This is ironclad. The bridge is your private property, maintained by county taxes under a grandfathered permit that predates the HOA charter by over 30 years. If they blocked it off, they didn't just overstep, they trespassed. You could sue the HOA for damages, and honestly, you'd win." She looked up at me, eyes gleaming. "We're not just talking about removing the barrier, we're talking about flipping the entire power structure upside down." That night, I spread everything out on the kitchen table: documents, blueprints, tax records, even the old photo of my grandfather. I saw it now for what it really was, not a piece of nostalgia, but a warning. The man in the picture had built that bridge with his own hands and sealed its ownership with paper and grit because he knew that someday someone would try to take it. He just hadn't counted on that someone wearing pearls and carrying a clip. I smiled for the first time in days. The game had changed. The next HOA meeting was in 48 hours, and this time I wasn't coming to comply. I was coming to claim. The day of the meeting, I arrived early, wearing the one button-down shirt I hadn't sweat through while hauling groceries through forest trails. The community center was already buzzing, more residents than I'd ever seen in one place, folding chairs filling fast, plastic name tags sticking to chests like accidental targets. Karen stood near the front, flanked by Frank Weber and two other board members, all of them dressed like they were auditioning for a very dull courtroom drama. But the real surprise stood beside them, a man in a sharp charcoal suit, arms crossed, face like a clenched jaw. He introduced himself to the room as Peter Dalrymple, HOA counsel. When Karen called the meeting to order, she immediately launched into a monologue so polished it might have been pre-approved by her therapist. "We're here tonight to address recent concerns regarding the status of the pedestrian bridge located between Lot 12B and the eastern property line of the Clearwater Pines HOA," she began, pausing for effect. "While we respect all residents, we must also protect the community from liability and misinformation. Mr. Ethan Walker has asserted ownership over a structure the HOA has maintained for years. We'll now review his claims and take comments accordingly." The crowd murmured. Karen gave her lawyer a nod. The man looked bored but opened a leather briefcase anyway. I waited, not for permission, but for silence. Then I stood, walked to the front, and laid my folder on the table like it was a winning hand in a high-stakes poker game. "I'm not here to make claims," I said calmly, making eye contact with as many people as possible. "I'm here to present facts." I passed around copies of the county-issued bridge permit, complete with the official seal and construction schematics dated 1963. Then the tax receipts, an unbroken chain of payment from my grandfather to me, covering 6 decades of bridge maintenance. "Cascade County recognizes this bridge as privately owned," I continued. "Its ownership has never lapsed. Every year, taxes have been paid. This isn't community property, it's personal property. And when the HOA blocked it off, they didn't protect the neighborhood. They trespassed." There was a beat of silence so thick you could hear someone's name tag peel off and flutter to the floor. Then came the voice that changed everything. From the back of the room, Curtis Myers, the county clerk, stood up. I'd asked him to attend, but didn't expect he'd actually speak. "Folks," he said, voice rough like sandpaper on wood, "I've processed those bridge taxes myself for 30 years. That structure belongs to Ethan Walker, always has. The HOA has no legal jurisdiction over it. Blocking it was not only inappropriate, it was illegal." He folded his arms and looked right at Karen. She didn't flinch, but the corners of her mouth pulled tight like a rope. Her lawyer muttered something and began flipping through a binder thick with bylaws. "While the documents appear authentic," he said slowly, "there may be ambiguity regarding community access rights. Long-term use might constitute implied easement." But Curtis cut him off with a scoff. "Not without paperwork, it doesn't. Neighborly use is just that, neighborly, not entitlement." Now the murmurs grew into actual conversation. People leaned in, whispering, reading the papers I'd passed out. For the first time since I'd moved back, the room wasn't with Karen. It wasn't against her either, but they weren't blindly following her anymore. Karen tried to reclaim the floor with a trembling smile in her usual teacher voice. "Let's remember," she said, "this is a community built on order. Mr. Walker's tone has not always reflected the cooperative spirit we value, but it didn't land. Her clipboard, her citations, her decades of micromanagement, they all felt suddenly small. I watched her fingers twitch over her pen. For the first time, she seemed uncertain, not angry, not smug, just unsure. That's when I knew. The grip was slipping. The bridge wasn't just wood and bolts, it was power. And she had just lost hers. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to argue. I just stood there, calm, while the crowd did the rest. One whisper, one doubt, one sideways glance at a woman who had for years ruled by fear dressed up as order. And as the meeting dissolved into quiet panic and board members shuffled papers with twitchy fingers, I walked out, but not before looking Karen square in the eyes and saying, "We're not done. Not yet." The next morning I was out early, not because I had to be, but because I wanted them to see. I carried a handmade wooden sign across the now cleared bridge and planted it at the entrance with a quiet satisfaction I hadn't felt in weeks. It read, "Favorite bridge, please nod before crossing." Beneath it, I strung a soft, chest-head rope between two wooden posts. It wasn't locked, wasn't heavy, wasn't meant to stop anyone. It was just a line, a reminder, a symbolic checkpoint to acknowledge the reality everyone had ignored for years. This was private property, and it was being shared, not surrendered. The reaction came fast. That first day, I watched from the porch as 3 cars approached the bridge. The first slowed. The driver, a woman I recognized from the HOA gardening committee, read the sign, blinked, then nodded awkwardly toward the cabin before lifting the rope and driving through. The second car didn't stop at all, just barreled forward, snapping the rope clean off. I tied it back up. An hour later, that same car returned, slower this time, no eye contact, but the rope stayed in place. And the third? The third was Karen. She parked halfway across, got out, stood with her arms crossed, and stared at the sign for a full 5 minutes like it had personally insulted her educational background. Then, without a word, she turned around, got back in her car, and drove off the long way around the lake. For 3 days, she took the detour, adding 10 minutes to every trip like it was a test of pride. Meanwhile, most of the residents adjusted with surprising grace. Some smiled, some nodded with exaggerated flair. A few just raised 2 fingers in a lazy peace sign and moved on. But the message was clear. People understood. This wasn't about tolls or punishment. It was about acknowledgement, about restoring a line that had been bulldozed under years of HOA micromanagement. Still, the absence of Karen on the bridge didn't mean she was done. On the morning of the 4th day, she called me. "Ethan," she said, and I noticed it was the first time she used my first name without sarcasm, "I'd like to speak in private." I agreed. We met at the same coffee shop where I'd once spread those dusty documents across a table with Lena. This time, Karen looked different. No clipboard, no blazer, just a cardigan and a tired posture that didn't match the woman who once fined me for aggressive gnome placement. She stirred her tea slowly before speaking. "I think we both know this has gone too far," she said. "You've made your point. You own the bridge. But there are 47 families who use it every day. This little performance," she gestured vaguely at the air, "is starting to make people uneasy." I let the words hang there for a moment. Then I leaned forward. "This isn't a performance," I said. "It's a boundary, something your rules have never respected." She bristled, but then I saw it, the slightest tremble in her hand as she picked up her cup. Fatigue, doubt, maybe even a crack in the fortress. "So," she said carefully, "what do you want?" I'd rehearsed this answer. I didn't want revenge. I wanted education, a message, a moment that would reset the balance, not tip it over. "We'll talk terms," I said, "but just know This bridge, it's not coming down. Not literally, not symbolically. If you want peace, Karen, then it starts with you walking across that line and nodding like everyone else. She didn't answer. But she didn't get up either. And for the first time since this all began, I saw her hesitate, not out of pride, but out of the dawning realization that the game she'd played for so long had changed completely. She didn't respond right away, just sat there staring into her tea like the swirl of milk might offer an escape clause. I gave her the space to process. For someone who'd built her authority on bullet points and bylaws, this wasn't just about admitting she'd lost. It was about confronting the fact that the rules no longer bent to her clipboard. After a long pause, she finally looked up. "What are your terms?" she asked. Her voice didn't have the sharp edge it used to. It sounded like someone still holding the steering wheel, but realizing the car had already veered off the road. I slid a folded sheet of paper across the table. 5 items, simple, firm, non-negotiable. First, all fines against me, past and pending, were to be dropped and refunded in full, $4,200.00. Second, a recorded public apology from Karen addressed to the community, acknowledging she had overstepped her authority and unlawfully blocked private property. Third, the HOA would establish an annual Freedom Week during which no minor citations could be issued, no mailbox measurements, no hose coil audits, no flag ratio reports. Fourth, the HOA would sign a formal easement agreement allowing continued community access across the bridge with my full consent, but under my terms. And finally, compensation of $30,000.00 for damages, lost income, and disruption to my livelihood, to be paid through the HOA reserve fund and, if necessary, special assessment. Karen blinked at the last one. 30,000? She repeated. That's excessive. I leaned back. That's educational. I left her sitting there with the paper, her lips pressed into a thin line. On Monday morning, I got my answer, not from Karen, but from the HOA newsletter. An emergency meeting had been held over the weekend. The community had voted. The terms were accepted. The apology video arrived in my inbox later that day. Karen stood at the foot of the bridge, hair down, no clipboard, no props. Just her and a shaky breath. She admitted to bypassing proper procedures, acknowledged the legality of my ownership, and apologized, not just to me, but to the community for the stress, fear, and overreach. She even paused halfway through to wipe her eyes. Whether it was for show or not, I didn't care. The symbolism was enough, and that was the point. Over the next few weeks, things shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but perceptibly. Citations dropped by 80%. Board meetings became open forums instead of rehearsed lectures. Neighbors who'd once looked through me now stopped to chat. Kids rode bikes across the bridge again. Some even saluted the sign as they passed. Karen faded a little from the spotlight, still on the board, but quieter, more measured. She even nodded once when crossing the bridge. That simple gesture, once beneath her, had become the toll, not in dollars, but in humility. And it worked. It changed things. I didn't charge anyone. I didn't restrict access. I just made it clear respect wasn't optional. It was the price of passage. 6 months later, I still lived in the cabin, not because I had to, but because I chose to. I'd launched a consulting business from the kitchen table, advising other communities on how to navigate property law and HOA overreach. My story had spread, shared in forums, local papers, even a podcast. People called me the bridge guy, which I didn't hate. But more importantly, I'd proven something my grandfather had always believed, that ownership isn't just about land. It's about standing your ground when someone tries to redraw the lines. The bridge still stands, strong, weathered, and indisputably mine. The sign remains too. Please nod before crossing. And they do, not out of fear, but because they know what it means now. A nod is simple, but it says everything. Sometimes the only thing standing between you and peace is a clipboard. But here's the truth. Bullies don't always shout. Sometimes they smile, speak in passive-aggressive legalese, and fine you for your mailbox being 1.8 inches too short. And when that happens, you have 2 choices. Comply endlessly and lose yourself inch by inch, or stand up, dig through your attic, and hit them with a 60-year-old document like it's the Declaration of Independence. This wasn't just about a bridge. It was about drawing a line, literally, and reminding people that respect doesn't come from power. It comes from boundaries. So if you're facing your own Karen, remember, nodding is free, but backing down, that'll cost you everything. And if all else fails, keep receipts, lots of them. Somewhere out there, your grandfather might be watching, and he definitely would wanted you to win that zoning dispute